Welcome to Santa Barbara Talks with Josh Molina. It's such a pleasure today to be here with author Deborah Larkin, who has written a tremendous book and is sort of the buzz of the town, the talk of the town in both Santa Barbara and Ventura because of this incredible story that she has written, which is part memoir, part sort of true crime, nonfiction. And we're going to talk about all of that today because this story is so incredible and so personal to her. Deborah, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine, and thanks for inviting me on the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure. You know, we talked not too long ago regarding a story I did on you about the book. So now we can sort of share our great conversation with our viewers and our listeners. You've written this story about this horrible crime that occurred, and I want to let you sort of tell the story. But we have this kidnapping, this abduction, and then we have this homicide, and it takes place in Santa Barbara, in Ventura County, and your father was right there at the heart of it, reporting on the story, and you were a little girl growing up watching all this, and then here you are, and now you've written this book to sort of tell this story. So this is just so fascinating. But Deborah, talk to me, what is this book about, and what does it mean to you to write it?
Okay. Olga Duncan was a young nurse who worked at Cottage Hospital, and she was married to an up-and-coming criminal defense attorney here in Santa Barbara by the name of Frank Duncan. But soon after they got married, within weeks, really, Frank started having problems with his mother. And she was threatening to kill herself if he didn't move back with her and leave Olga. And dutiful son that Frank was, he left his wife in her apartment on Garden Street by herself and moved back to live with his mother, although he continued to go and see Olga. Olga was 7 months pregnant at the time. And on the night of November 17th, 1958, she had invited two friends of hers from the hospital, two other nurses, to come over, and they had coffee and what they called hot buns. I'm not exactly sure what that is. And Olga showed off some baby clothes that she'd been making for her unborn child. And the nurses' friends left about 11:10, and Olga was never seen alive again. As far as my story, I'll go on a little farther. So the Santa Barbara police investigated it the first day and a half, maybe. They thought this might be a runaway wife, and that Frank was saying, well, she's doing it because she's mad at me, because I'm living with my mother, and she's just taken off to give me a hard time. And but soon they started hearing from her friends and talking to her parents who lived in Canada that she had been having trouble with her mother-in-law. So they started investigating this really around the clock, trying to find Olga. And they were developing some leads, and they had a strong suspicion of who was responsible for Olga disappearing, but they didn't have the kind of evidence they needed to go to court. And a lot of things happened, but a month later, on December 21st, 1958, Olga's body was discovered buried in a shallow grave out on Casitas Pass Road. And it was just 6 miles into Ventura County. And the police had evidence that Olga was murdered at the gravesite. So the whole case moved from Santa Barbara to Ventura. And my father had been interested in doing a little reporting on it before, when Olga was missing, because it became a big mystery all over Ventura and Santa Barbara. And he became the lead reporter for his newspaper, the Ventura County Star Free Press, to cover this case. And where I came in is I was a real curious, child. I was 10 years old. I liked Nancy Drew. I liked to watch Dragnet if I could talk my parents into letting me watch that. And so my dad used to bring home other newspapers after work and read them at home. And he brought home a copy of the Santa Barbara News Press and left it open, folded open to the story, a little story that appeared on November 19th about Olga disappearing from her apartment. And she didn't show up for surgery that morning, and the hospital sent somebody out to look for her. And so I read that, and it was, I don't know, it was a pivotal moment for me. I was already kind of a anxious, worried little girl. And the idea that someone would just vanish from their home in the middle of the night was just astonishing to me. And not only did I worry about Olga, but I also worried that who was next? Could this happen to me? And so I was very focused on it and kept pestering my father to get any further news. And that's how I got involved. And then my father was really, he was quite a character. He was very well liked and well known in Ventura. He was outspoken and friendly and humorous. And he also had no filter. Somebody, and
sounds
that's
like
what
a
I
journalist.
like maybe, yeah. As far as he was concerned, all the news of the world should be discussed at home, whether the children were there or not. And it was funny because I've heard from a number of different people since this book came out, and one of my father's colleagues, who is still living, said that he laughed when he read that I said he had no filter, because he said, this man said he had no filter in the newsroom either. We never knew what he was going to say. So that's how I became interested in it. And I learned a lot of details from my father. I read all of his newspaper articles every day. And I worried about Olga. I worried about when she was missing. And later I was very much wanting the criminals to be held accountable. I was a pretty hard-nosed little girl at the time. I really wanted those people punished.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about what it was like growing up, the daughter of a journalist, in a second, but I want to stay focused on the story.
Okay.
But what an incredible situation. You've got a mother-in-law who is jealous, I guess, of her son's wife, and they're going to have a baby, and then so much so, I mean, we know there's often there's trouble with the spouse and the mother. We know that exists, sometimes it's the comedy line, the mother-in-law. So we know that exists, but for somebody to actually go to all this trouble to look for somebody to kidnap and kill, and as I understand it, these two who did it weren't the first people that were asked. That
right.
This mother-in-law was looking for other people to do it. Did you dive into the psychology?
She shopped all over Santa Barbara for killers. That's the way my dad put it. Yeah.
Wow.
And a lot of people knew.
And nobody said anything. Can you imagine, like, knowing that this happening and not saying anything?
Yes, Olga's life could have been saved if somebody had just gone to the police or gone to Olga, but nobody did. Some of them said they all turned her down, and they said, well, they couldn't believe that she was serious, so they didn't go to the police or to Olga. And others were family members of clients who were of Frank's criminal defense practice. They were one of them was somebody he represented, and others were wives, and they were in an element in Santa Barbara that wasn't real anxious to go talk to the police. They didn't go looking for the police, so they didn't say anything either.
Now, in the description of A Lovely Girl, I mean, in the book jacket on the website, it talks about how when there was the trial, there was sort of this hint or this like allusion to an incestuous relationship. Yeah. And I'm wondering, did you dive into it all during your research, the psychology of what was happening with this mother-in-law and the son? And this seems extremely unusual.
I didn't really know after all of the research if there was an incestuous relationship with Frank and his mother. And even the prosecutor in Ventura who prosecuted the case, well, let me get back to this. He was the one that was sort of putting out a lot of insinuations that was going on. The only person they had that really said anything about it was Mrs. Duncan's what I call sidekick, her 80-year-old neighbor who was with her every step of the way. And she said that she believed that they lived as man and wife. But, you know, I don't know. In his closing arguments to the jury, Gustafson, you know, put out something about, oh, well, they lived in an apartment where there was only one bed, and immediately Frank or Mrs. Duncan's defense attorney objected and said, "Wait a second, that was cleared up. They never said that." And then he backed off and he said, "Oh, okay, well, I misspoke. I'm sorry." He said, "And I never meant to say that there was a sexual relationship between them. I just meant to say that there was a unusually close relationship." And I talked to someone I know who's a psychologist and asked her about some things. And she says that there's something in psychology that's not necessarily really well accepted. I believe it's called covert incest. And that's more where the parent makes the child the adult, the parent, and turns it all around. And the parent becomes very dependent on the child, and so, you know, I don't know, that's a possibility also. But whether there was incestuous relationship between Frank and his mother, I don't know. But the reader will have to decide for themselves.
Right. And
evidence.
These two individuals who finally were hired to kill Olga, who were they? How were they found? How did the mother-in-law find them? And
well,
was there an amount they were going to get paid, or what was the payoff?
Well, the two that were the hired killers, the amateur hired killers, were Louis Moya and Augustine Baldonado. And they worked at the Tropical Cafe, and bar, which was down on Lower State Street. And it was run by a woman and her husband, the Escovals. And so Mr. Escoval had been represented by Frank on a burglary and fencing charge, I believe. And Frank got him a 1-year sentence in county jail. So that's how Mrs. Duncan knew them. And the story that she told was that she was walking down State Street and was in front of the cafe, and she was pulled in by, I believe, Louis Moya, and they said, we want our money back. Mrs. Escobar wants her money back for what she paid Frank because he didn't get him off. So that was something that she made up. In reality, she went to the cafe. She happened to notice it when she and Mrs. Short had been out. So she went in and talked to her and introduced her and says, "Oh, you remember me? I'm Frank Duncan. My son was your husband's lawyer." And so they got a cup of coffee, and then she started asking Mrs. Escobar, "Well, I've got this problem. Do you happen to know anybody who could help me get rid of my daughter-in-law?" And she said all sorts of terrible things. She used to make up all kinds of stories about Olga. And Mrs. Escobar said, "Well, why don't you come back tomorrow and I'll see them. I might know two guys who would be interested in doing it, or interested in a job." And so that was Louis Moya and Augustine Baldonado. And they sort of worked part-time for Mrs. Duncan, just helping her clean up. And I think they kind of got paid in free beer at the bar. And so that's how she knew them. And Mrs. Duncan, when she went back the next day, she told them what she wanted to have done. And Louis Moya did all the talking. And really, Baldonado just sort of followed along. So they settled on a price, and Mrs. Duncan went up the block to Honor Rings at Cohen's pawn shop and got $175 and came back and paid them that, which she had promised them $6,000, but that was the down payment. And then after Olga was gone, Louis Moya started calling her, wanting the rest of the money. Well, she didn't have any money because Frank paid for everything. And so she had to, try to figure out a way to get some more money to pay them. And that was the unraveling of the case when she tried to do that.
Okay. Yeah. And obviously murder is horrible in all cases, but to kill a pregnant woman it
know.
feels as though that's like even more evil.
Right.
Obviously, if she's 7 months pregnant, these two know she's pregnant.
Right. Exactly.
What
And I can't believe she wasn't screaming, "Don't hurt my baby."
yeah.
I believe every pregnant woman would be, trying to protect their belly and screaming, "Please don't hurt my baby." And so the fact that those two insisted later that they had no idea she was pregnant, I find that hard to believe.
Yeah, and I know we want people to read your book, but what was the actual moment where they abducted her? How did they do that? Where was she?
Well, I'm willing to, to talk about this because there's so many details. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many other, so much more information in there that yeah, when those nurse friends left at 11:10 that night on November 17th, Moya and Baldonado happened to be coming up just a few moments later, and they came up to the apartment and they concocted this plan where Lewis went up and knocked on the door, because remember, Frank wasn't living there, and he said, "Oh, we have your husband downstairs, and he's had quite a lot to drink, and he's got a lot of money on him, a lot of cash, and I don't think he can make it up the stairs, so can you come down and help us get him up here?" And Olga says, "Well, sure." And she goes down and they opened the back door. Louis Moya was laying in the back seat pretending to be Frank, kind of covered with his face covered, and she leaned in, and Louis Moya hit her in the back of the head with a gun, pushed her in, and they took off with her.
Wow. And as we talked about, and for that other story that I did on you, they were kind of bumbling, right? They had some trouble on Cabrillo Boulevard. Can you walk us through a little bit of how they ended up near Ojai?
They didn't even own a car, and they didn't own a gun, and so they borrowed a car, they borrowed a gun. Mrs. Duncan, for some reason, bought them some black leather gloves. They had asked for that, and some tape, I think they had. So that car was just really in very bad shape, and it was running rough even when they got her. And so as they headed down from Garden, they got down on Cabrillo, and the car began to sputter. And they stopped in a parking lot on Cabrillo, partly because it was sputtering, but partly because Olga was screaming. I mean, they had tried to hit her. I think they'd hit her on the head with a gun numerous times, and she still wasn't unconscious. She was screaming, and they broke the gun, and they finally kind of got it going again. So the original plan, when they were supposed to take her down to Mexico, down to Tijuana, kill her there, bury her there, but they had to come up with plan B, and they were on 101, and they took the road to Ojai, and that's where they killed her and buried her out there.
And we'll move on from these really macabre details here, but was she buried alive, or was there some suggestion that she might have been, or still alive? They buried her?
What when Baldonado was the first to crack, and when they were questioning him, she talked about what they'd done to kill her, and I guess it was the investigator that said, "Well, how did you know she was dead?" And he said, "Well, I took her pulse. I think she was," and that's what he said. "I think she was dead." And then they just threw her in that hole and buried her.
So, your book covers that, but it obviously covers the trial as well. And
big part of it is the trial.
And so there's so much there, and we'll get to that a little bit of that. But I want to ask you, you're 10 years old. So this happens when you're 10. So you're young. Your father's a journalist. And you're sort of learning about the world very bluntly when he's talking at the kitchen table about what's going on. And you were somebody who was very curious. You read mystery books, and you were interested in this. As a 10-year-old, can you take us back?
I took the stories of Olga's disappearance to school to share. The teacher wouldn't let me share them. She cut me off. But yeah, I was actually doing that too. I was obsessed.
This was a really impactful. And so I want to ask you, as a 10-year-old, can you just talk about what that was like? I mean, you said you were concerned this could happen to you. I mean, it must have been terrifying for you.
Well, in 1958, that was a different, more innocent, unsophisticated era for me and for the communities of Ventura and Santa Barbara. And I think at least in my, I was a child, so I didn't know a lot of it, but I sort of believed that these things only happened down in Los Angeles and not in our safe little communities. I thought that we were really pretty safe.
Mhm.
So when this happened to Olga, that was just a real jolt. And I think I mentioned this. I was very concerned with Olga. What I was worried, what was somebody doing to her? But I was very afraid for myself. And this really, I think this case spurred a lifelong interest in true crime. And I would read those books, trying to understand about killers and what could I do to protect myself. I was particularly interested in the women who got away. Maybe I would need that information someday. So, yeah, I think that I was already an anxious kid, and this just really fed into that anxiety.
And
I
so,
still lock my doors and, latch and bolt everything.
well, now in 2022, I mean, we have to, right? I mean, it's
I know. Well, I was ahead of
world.
my time. Yeah.
And there's a lesson from all of this that you want people to take away. I mean, this isn't just compelling reading about a horrible crime and then a court trial and then a verdict. There's a lesson you want people to know and take away from this for those who read that book. Can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Well, I think that we focus, women and readers of true crime like me, that about the homicidal maniac, the serial killer. We worry about that. And the reality for women is that most women who are murdered by a family member. And in Olga's case, it was her mother-in-law. And also, I'd like people to take that away. And also that Olga didn't need to be murdered. If those people in Santa Barbara who Mrs. Duncan had talked to about getting rid of her mother-in-law had spoken up, that this wouldn't have happened. And I think that the lesson is, when we know that somebody's in danger, we need to speak up. I think we have an obligation to look out for each other, and to just let that slide and think, oh, she's probably not going to do it. At least let the person that she's threatening know.
Yeah, it's so important. I mean, how many times have we heard about these horrible things happening in a neighborhood, and people always knew that house was a weird house, or they always walked by but just kind of ignored it, and then all of a sudden they find out that someone's been kidnapped, they've been living there, and somebody escaped from there. And it's so important to tell somebody if you see something kind of weird.
And I think these would have been credible reports to the police, because it wasn't just that these people thought she might do something. They'd actually been offered money themselves to commit this crime. So I believe that the police would have at least investigated it when somebody's being offered money to act as a hitman.
Yeah. And the other part of the story, though, which is really interesting to me as a journalist, is you deciding to write this story at this time in your life. This was 10 when it happened, and you obviously have your own family and your own career, and then you decide you want to write this book. So can you talk about the decision to do that and how you went about it?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I want to say, I guess I think you asked the question, but I didn't answer it about being the journalist. My father also wrote this column, a weekly column in the paper that was about all kinds of things, everything that he was interested in, and he was interested in everything. And he also wrote quite a few about our family. And I was quite embarrassed about that, to be in the column. And he wrote, and sometimes my mother got mad at him because he would write about things that she did. And but I when I wrote this book, I was kind of combining that family Dave Barry type column about our family, but still everything linked to this murder investigation, intertwined that with the somewhat of a crime procedural that tells the crime. And I did write it in a genre that is referred to now as creative nonfiction. So the book reads more like a novel, the way that I've written it, and I can explain that. So, okay, when did I decide to write this?
Let me just say, though, in defense of your father, we love that as journalists. Any opportunity we have, if you write a column to let people know about our families. But also the other side of that coin is sometimes those family members don't want that attention.
Right. And I address that at the end of the book.
Oh, okay.
I finally tell him, I don't want to be that little girl in the column anymore. I'm growing up. So anyway, I had always thought that I wanted to be a writer. I thought I would write mysteries like maybe Nancy Drew or Agatha Christie. And when I went away to college to University of California, Davis, I didn't, and people would ask me what you were going to major in, what do you want to do? I would say, oh, well, I don't know. I don't know. Because I thought that if I said I wanted to be a writer, that's sort of a lofty goal. And that, so I said, I don't know what I want to be, but I know I don't want to be a teacher. I said that. But at the end of when I graduated, 1970s, just like a lot of other women with college educations, I went into education and got a teaching credential. So I never really gave up on the idea of writing mysteries. That was something I wanted to do. And in education, I did do some writing. I wrote a lot of great grants, and I got a lot of money from my school because I could kind of use my writing and storytelling skills to do the grant. But as soon as my youngest son left for college, I immediately enrolled in the University of California at San Diego extension creative writing class, and I took 30 some units in that. And I kept trying at that time to fictionalize this story because this story stayed with me this whole time. I mean, I thought about it and wondered about the motivation, and I don't know, it just stuck with me. And it's a really interesting, compelling story. And so when I tried to fictionalize it, I eventually realized that this is really stranger than fiction, and that when I was taking classes and talking to the professors, that an editor at a publishing house might not think that a novel based on that story was believable. So I started to think about, okay, I would write true crime. And I was in a writing, part of the San Diego Writers Inc. Writing community here. And I went to reading critique groups. And in that process, I ended up realizing how that I could, actually the leader of the groups that suggested this, that I could combine what I was working on into a book about the crime. And what I had been doing is, in this reading critique group, I had been bringing in both personal essays about my dad and about our family, kind of in the style of his column. And then I had been writing more of a crime procedural about the actual events of the investigation and the murder. And one night I brought in an essay about how my father had his first power lawnmower was named the Mrs. D, and he had named it after Mrs. Duncan, the murderer. And he was using it one day later, long after he'd gotten it. And he was trying to get grass out from under the catcher thing there without turning off the lawnmower because it was really hard to start. And the Mrs. D cut off the ends of 2 of his fingers. And he wrote this, and so I wrote about this in the essay, and how he was screaming that the lawnmower was a homicidal maniac, and he was really very dramatic. And so we started talking. They said, you could write what was going on with your family, this quirky family life, and my mother's a psychiatric social worker, and she had her opinions about the case, and then combine it with chapters about what was going on with the investigation and the trial and everything. And that's how I ended up writing it in that way.
Alternating chapters, and then
mostly, yeah. But as the book progresses, you get more and more of the crime story. The momentum is building, and so it's not so much alternating it once it gets halfway through. More of the crime story.
So I want to nerd out a little bit on the writing process here.
Sure.
What did you learn from taking those 30 plus units at UC San Diego. I think you said,
yeah, UC San Diego.
what did you learn? I mean, everybody loves to write. They want to write. They think they know how to write, and there's it's really difficult. It's tough. But what did you learn, and how did you apply that to your novel?
Mainly, like I say, I was writing this in creative nonfiction where I had scenes and dialogue and everything. So in that writing program, I learned to write dialogue. I learned to write scenes, to write descriptions, and just, kind of the pace of the dialogue. It just so different than, when I was writing all those grants. Yeah, I was a great writer, but it's totally different. And I've seen, in being in that reading critique group, that some people will cycle through and they come and the first instinct is to just tell the story. It's all telling. It's just this happened and then this happened and then she did this and she did that. And people don't use what they call showing. They say show, don't tell. And you show by having it in dialogue, by the actions people take in a scene. And so those kinds of things are what I learned and developed in the writing program at UCSD.
And so you chose to write this book recently. Okay, so
yes.
You did it after your youngest son went to college, so you had this newfound time. Did your father, was he ever able to see you, or did he know that you were going to start this process?
No.
What was that like?
Well, he passed away in 1987 when I was, that's, gosh, how long ago is that? It's 30 plus years ago, and unexpectedly. And so, no, he didn't. But I had all of his files. And he talked about it long after that case ended. He continued to talk about it. And he even, there's a quote in something that he wrote, maybe one of his columns, that he said, and he was about, I think it must have been the anniversary of one of the disappearance, or, something, Olga's disappearance. And he said in there, if I'm lucky enough to live another 20 years, I'll probably be boring young reporters in the newsroom with my tales about this remarkable, he called it the remarkable Duncan case, and this incredible trial that journalists from all over the country came. It was not only a big story in Ventura and in Santa Barbara, it was a big story all across the country. I have some Time magazine articles that were written, and like I said, there were journalists from all over and just descended on little Ventura.
And so let's talk a little bit about that, because you grew up the daughter of a reporter, so investigation, and you had that sort of interest already, but research is sort of in your blood. You watched it. To write a book is much different than writing a newspaper article. A newspaper article, you have to know enough and be accurate, and you give it to your editor and you publish. And if there's more to learn the next day, you do it again. Sometimes you have a few days, you can work on a project. A book is very different. Can you talk about what kind of research did you do? Obviously, you weren't able just to do a search of newspaper articles. So
no, but I did do that. But it took me 9 years to write the book, and I was continuing to do research the whole time I was writing, and I wasn't happy. I wanted this book to be the very best I could do. So anyway, the research, partly I had my dad's files. I had all of his clippings of his articles, and I had his discussions, because he and I continued to talk about this case, long after I was an adult. Then the trial transcripts were fantastic. Everybody testified. The actual hired killers got on the stand and told in excruciating detail everything they did during how they were hired, the kidnapped. How I know how they were kidnapped, and then what happened when they took her up on Casitas Pass. All these witnesses testified about what happened. And then journalists, I don't think journalists do these things today. At least I don't notice them when I'm reading an article, but it seemed to be the thing to do. And I was researching 4 different newspapers to describe exactly what each witness was wearing. Sometimes they gave us the hairstyle. their demeanor on the stand. And so that helped me really set the scenes. Then in the trial, then they also, the DA and the defense attorney, especially the defense attorney, sometimes granted impromptu interviews with reporters during the recess or before or after court. So, and then in the newspaper articles, they filled in if there was some sort of drama going on in the courtroom. That didn't necessarily show up in the transcript, but I was filled in by looking at the date of the transcript and the date of the articles, and then I could see what was going on in the courtroom. And honestly, those transcripts were just riveting. The testimony, I felt as I was reading them that I was right there in the courtroom. A lot of it was very dramatic testimony. And so then I was fortunate enough to have access to the district attorney, as I think I mentioned, was Roy Gustafson. And he wrote a memoir that was unpublished. He never found a publisher, that was just about the Duncan case, as he called it, and his thoughts about the trial and a little bit about his strategy and things that he worried about. So when I read that it just gave me insight to what he was thinking and what he was trying to do in the trial. So that was very helpful. I had 2 letters that Olga wrote home to her parents that I found in the exhibits in the appeal cases that gave an idea of what Olga thought of the situation a little bit. And then also, I know that I'm missing something else that was really a good resource. Oh, I had some interviews. The Santa Barbara detective Charlie Thompson, I picked up in the when I was reading the newspaper articles that right there at the time that Olga disappeared, there was a little article that Charlie got suspended by his lieutenant for calling him obscene words. And he was then had quite the role when he came back, because he's the one that interviewed Mrs. Short. They were able to discover a lot about what happened. So anyway, something was being said on Facebook, and I was kind of following it. The I Grew Up in Ventura page, where they're talking about the Duncan case, and I saw this woman who responded that, oh, my father was Charlie Thompson, and he was the one that broke the case with it. And so I just got in touch with her. And so, yeah, she knew some things that her father had said, but the main thing she gave me told me about Charlie's personality and the kinds of things that he said and thought. And so that was helpful in writing, a character that was more than just, flat, that just somebody I didn't know anything about. So that was helpful. And then my own, I was there.
What's that?
I was there. I had the feel of 1950s living in Ventura.
Yeah, and all of those court records, that was Ventura County, you had to go to the courthouse to find those, or was anything online? I mean, that must be, as somebody who's researched court records, that could be exhausting.
Yeah. Right. Well, here's what happened. By the time I called the DA's office to ask about getting copies of the transcripts, something else had to already happen, and so there's a man that I know that went to my high school. He was a couple years ahead of me. Was a paper boy at the same time, and he was delivering the newspapers. And like me, he became very interested in the case. And so, as he was folding the papers before he delivered them on the bike, he would read the stories. So he became very interested. So fast forward to 2000, about. He works for a law firm that Roy Gustafson, the district attorney, had founded soon after he left the DA's office. And so they were closing down the law firm. And Bob was searching, or was cleaning out the firm's law library. And up on the top shelf, he discovered some bound transcripts, gathering dust up there. And he opened them. And when he saw it, because of his paperboy experience and growing up in Ventura, he knew exactly what they were. So that's how the DA's office got them back again. And they were very grateful. They said they just thought they were lost. They didn't know what would happen to them. And it turns out Roy took them over there when he was trying to write this memoir, and then just never took them back because he apparently was worried that maybe the DA's office would throw them out or something. But that's how those were available. And then when I called to get them a year or so after, a couple of years after Bob had found them, the woman was, at the time, she was called a secretary to the district attorney. And fortunately, she was very near retirement and she had known my dad, and she was just very helpful in making sure that I got all those transcripts. And there was 5,000 pages, and she ran them all off for me.
Yeah. And did your dad, did he ever say, someday I'm going to write a book about this? And use, is any part of this sort of your, like, I want to carry
he died.
On?
Well, I say at the end of the book that my father died very unexpectedly, and I never felt like I got to say goodbye. I was very upset about that. And so I feel like I wrote this this is my goodbye to my father, and that he said he wanted to write the book, but he never seemed to find the time. So I dedicated the book both to him and to Olga. So he was my inspiration for writing this.
And sure,
I say,
go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't want to, I don't want to give away the last line, so I won't say it anyway. It was about my feelings about why I wrote the book.
We'll have to read it to find that out. But I'm sure he's proud of you as a journalist to know that, your child, your daughter would carry on that tradition by memorializing the great work that he spent so much of his career on. I'm sure that somewhere he's very proud of what you've done.
I think he would be proud. And even though I wrote it in creative nonfiction, every detail that's about the case is absolutely the truth. And the way I could create scenes in that truthful dialogue is there was so much said in the trial transcripts that I could write the scenes that they're part of the, as the story was told. Oops. Hello.
Yeah, we lost each other just for a second there. But we're back. Is anyone still around from this trial, from the family? Who's still here that might have an interest in your book who was around then?
Well, the one person that is still alive, all of those people that were the major parts of the story are all gone except for one person, and that's Frank Duncan, and he won't say anything. If he's been asked many times for an interview, I called once, and he simply says, that's all in the past. I don't talk about it. And that's the end of the story. So I don't know if he would. Frank is Olga's husband. This is the son? Right. He's Olga's husband. He's probably around 94 years old. But after the trial, he moved to Los Angeles. He had a successful law career, married at least twice, again, had a daughter. And then the third marriage, I believe it was, lasted for 40 years. And he was quite happy. But the same man that had discovered those trial transcripts became a magistrate judge in Los Angeles. And he saw Frank in his court a number of times. The last time when Frank was in his early 90s, and he said, he was always a very courtly is the word he would describe him as. And he said he seemed really sharp in court when he just was helping an old client at an arraignment or something. But he continued to practice law for a long time.
Okay. Well, Deborah, this has been a really fun conversation, and this book has been really popular. People are talking about it. What's before we wrap up, what's the reception been for you to be able to do these book signings and these events?
Right.
How are people receiving your work?
Really well. I mean, of course, a lot of the people I hear from are people that I know, but yeah, especially friends who grew up in Ventura. Because when I was writing the book, they say that authors kind of write for a certain audience. And I really wanted to get it right about for people who grew up in Ventura or Santa Barbara at that time, that they would be able to relate this to their childhood. Maybe they weren't obsessed with Olga Duncan, but that the things that I talk about that we did was something that they could identify. And I do think that I've succeeded in that. Now, I've seen on my author Facebook page comments from some people that I don't know personally, and it seems to be receiving, a really good reception. People are interested. This is why it stuck with me, and I wanted to write about it. It is a very interesting, compelling story. And I like to think that the family part, the memoir part that I've included, that touches on this more innocent era before the dramatic changes of the 1960s, family life at that time, that is of interest to a lot of people.
All right. And tell us where we can get the book. Where can people find this book?
Well, you can go to any of your local bookstores. If they don't have it in stock, they can always order it from you. For you, you can go to my website, DeborahHoltLarkin.com, and there are links to Simon Schuster is distributing it. You can go on their link, and it will get you lots of places. And then, of course, Amazon has it on their link. But you can pretty much get it wherever they sell books.
And how cool you signed with a really legitimate big name publisher for your first work. That's amazing.
Right, and there's a whole other story about. Should I keep going? But
yeah, go ahead.
There's a whole. Yeah, I am a woman of a certain age. I had no platform. It wasn't like I had been a police detective or a journalist or anything for writing true crime. And I also, I was told, by them who know these things, that my book would never get picked up because it's a mixed genre. It's true crime, and it is a memoir, and that publishers really like, just especially for a first book, they want to be able to put it in a box to be able to sell it to fans of a certain genre. That's how they know how to market it. And then also, there's no getting around that I am older, because all you have to do the math is I was 10 years old in 1958, and publishers don't necessarily want to sign someone who's an older author, because they like to establish long-term relationships with their authors, that they will go on to sell multiple books. So there was a lot of things that made me feel that. But I honestly, it didn't really faze me. I just felt that this was a story that I wanted to tell, and if I rewrote it, I had many rewrites, because I wanted it to be not just good enough. I wanted it to be a really good book that I would want to read. And I then Santa Barbara. So I've gone to a number of writers' conferences, and so I came to the Santa Barbara Writers Conference, the last one they had in 2019. My son had urged me, he says, "Mom, it started in Santa Barbara. You should go to that writing conference, and maybe you can find an agent there." And sure enough, I did one of those advanced readings, give them 10 pages, the agent talks to you. And you can hope that they might ask for another 10 pages. Sometimes they just critique what you've given them and tell you why it won't sell. But I sat down with Charlotte Gosset, and she said, first thing, she said, "Okay, I loved your 10 pages. Send me your whole manuscript." Wow. And the top of my head almost blew off. I thought, and confetti came out. I said, okay, and then we worked together for a while to resolve a few issues in pacing. And then she signed me after we worked that out. And she pitched the book for a good 7 or 8 months. And there was a little bit of a problem where it wasn't this straight, ripped from the headlines, blood and gore true crime that publishers of that particular genre knew how to market. But Pegasus Book and editor Jessica Case, she had worked with Charlotte before, and she took the manuscript, and she loved it. She believed in the book, and I was offered a contract, which I immediately signed, no questions asked, as far as I was concerned.
And the rest is
So
history.
yeah, so that's how it happened.
I can't wait for the movie. This sounds like it's going to be an incredible movie one day. Well, Deborah, thanks a lot for your time. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope people have the opportunity to read A Lovely Girl and follow your work down the road. And thank you for your time.
I hope so too. Okay, well, thank you for having me, Joshua. Good night.
Good night.